Hello, my name is MacLean, and welcome to Leveraging Thinky Principles for Accessible Design. I should start by saying I'm not necessarily an expert on Thinky games or accessibility, but I have been making games professionally since 2004. Most of my work has been in RPGs and online trading card games, and for most of my career, accessibility wasn't a primary concern. But as the years rolled by and various games were hits and misses, a pattern emerged that a lot of well-received features often coincided with accessible design principles, even if accessibility wasn't the initial motivation for our decisions. I was the lead designer on South Park: The Stick of Truth, and the design team was tasked with making turn-based combat that had some active elements. So we took a lot of cues from Paper Mario's combat, complete with using button presses to defend yourself when an opponent attacks, but we made defending a trigger hold that rewarded but didn't require perfect timing. You could, in essence, be lazy and just hold the block trigger and only take a token amount of damage. And we balanced the game so you didn't need to master this timing either. It was a very small shift, but it got us a lot of positive feedback from playtesters, and it was instrumental in making the game approachable instead of punishing. And on the RPG Tyranny, we were writing a lot of branching dialogue and trying to offer fun moments of choice and consequence. I didn't really want to be bogged down writing a bunch of "tell me more about this faction, please" style question and answer moments. So in order to be a lazy narrative designer, I asked the tools programmer for the ability to have explanatory text when you mouse over certain words. Even if laziness was the motivating incident for this feature, this ended up being a well-received quality of life feature that many people said really helped them dive into the story without worrying about having to memorize the names of people, places, and events. We had lowered the cognitive burden of navigating our conversations, and conversations became less stressful to play. Eventually, I got it in my head to quit my job, light my savings on fire, and start my own indie studio, Generic Lake Monster. We made our first game, Quarterstaff, a turn-based fantasy adventure inspired by a desire to distill the best parts of RPG progression and strategic conflict without the pain points common to RPGs, without random number generators ruining your good tactics. We embarked on a journey with accessibility in mind, and in the end, our focus on accessibility resulted in a game with a lot of Thinky-like qualities. If our attempt to make something accessible led to Thinky gameplay, it's safe to say that Thinky gameplay is already on the road to accessibility. So just to take a step back, many of you may already know a lot about accessibility design, and some of you may be new to the concept entirely, so it's maybe worth defining our terms. Accessibility is about removing obstacles in your game's input and interface that make your game playable to a wider audience. And good accessibility design doesn't just help widen your audience of potential players. It can make your game less stressful and aggravating to players who maybe don't need accessibility affordances all the time, but may have bad days and temporary distractions that make them grateful for the accessibility affordances you've offered them. Or put it in another sense, some gamers are one-handed because they lost an arm in a car accident. Some gamers are one-handed because they're the sole caretaker of a child and can't put that child down. But you can serve both players with the same developmental efforts. I'm hoping to present to you a bevy of good reasons why accessibility is good for your game. But if I may speak directly to your selfish side, let me point out that all of us will someday be disabled gamers unless we skip ahead directly to dead gamer. So let's make games we can enjoy when we're old and falling apart, since that's maybe, just maybe, when most of us will finally have time to go through our backlog of games. And having now made a game with a lot of accessibility features, I can tell you that many of the features one might make for the sake of accessibility, like say an undo button, serve double duty as debugging tools for development. Making games is a lot of work, and accessibility features are by no means free or trivial to implement. But if you view accessibility features as a way to make your game less stressful to test, and not just less stressful to play, the work spent on accessibility features can save you dev time in the long run. And really, the whole thrust of my talk is that Thinky-style games are already serving a lot of accessibility needs. So you are in a better position than, say, makers of first-person shooters to deliver a game full of accessibility affordances that anyone can play. Most Thinky-style games already assist players with motor control concerns by having patient, turn-based gameplay. Why not take this easy-to-play formula and take it even farther? Now, there are a lot of angles to look at in accessibility design. The most important component is interface accessibility. Since players who can't make sense of your game are those who have to fight with the controls to accomplish basic moves, they're not going to make it very far in your game. You want your players struggling with your fun puzzles. You don't want them struggling with the game itself. And even players who are capable of playing your game may find individual moments or the overall pacing of your game to be stressful or fatiguing. While some will equate an easy mode to good stress management, I think there's a bit more to it than that. And lastly, there's a notion of content opt-out of sensitive material. Sometimes the pain point that makes a player stop playing your game, is like a spider or a depiction of drowning, excessive bloodshed, or some other experiential detail that becomes a hard stop for the player. I want to cover that last one first, since it's the easiest to discuss in terms of Thinky game design. I think I can safely generalize and say that most Thinky games are not reliant on jump scares, gore, scary monsters, or things like that to deliver on their core experience. So most Thinky games are unlikely to have content that players may find objectionable. But one person's cute spider is another arachnophobe's nightmare fuel. So I'm also going to generalize and say here that most Thinky games that do have spiders or snakes or whatnot that might startle people, they likely don't have millions of animations for those snakes or spiders. So as long as you coordinate with your team early on, it shouldn't be that difficult to identify assets that are in need of alternate opt-out replacement assets or replacement sprite sheets. Players who want this feature will be happy with anything that removes the offending material. So your replacement art asset doesn't need to be the same visual fidelity as whatever you made your original spider or snake to be like. Really, the fact that you gave the player an alternative, that'll be what makes them smile. They're not going to be mad about the replacement asset being a little bit janky. So with the easy stuff out of the way, let's talk about interface concerns. There are a lot of ways a player might fail to interpret or interface with your game. And while you can never anticipate all the ways a player might find friction with your game, a little planning can prevent a lot of pain points. Players may come to your game with all sorts of challenges. They may be deaf, they may miss your audio cues, and miss any speech without subtitles. Maybe they're colorblind or totally blind. They may struggle to hold a controller or be unable to press pause when they need to step away from your game. For Thinky-style games, audio accessibility is possibly the easiest thing to address. Obviously, if you're making a Thinky game with music puzzles, you'll have some work ahead of you to make your game playable for deaf players. But for just about every other Thinky game out there, you can really just follow two important rules. First is just always have subtitles where you have speech. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that if your project can afford voiceover, you can hopefully afford subtitles as well. Really, the more important second rule is never rely on only a sound cue. Always pair a sound cue with a secondary visual indicator. Not many Thinky games rely on spoken instructions. That subtitle thing isn't as important, but really the sound cues are where Thinky games can go astray with audio accessibility issues. Let's say you have a hidden object mechanic, and you play a special sound to indicate to the player that they're on the right track. That's fine. You just need to make sure that that sound isn't the only way you signal the player. Otherwise, your deaf players will miss it entirely. And when you're thinking about this or just any other accessibility issue, remember that you're not just making your game accessible for players who are deaf. You're making your game playable for those who don't have like the private space to play your game with sound on or headphones. When it comes to visual accessibility concerns, colorblindness is a common problem and one that puzzle games often fail to address. This picture of Puzzle Fighter involves gems of 4 different colors, but I can only see 3. And despite being red colorblind, I can see the red from the green just fine. It's the yellow and the green that look identical to me. And here, the yellow and green gems have nearly identical shapes. This is a fantastic example of what not to do. If you're going to mash colors this close together, you need to be using distinct shapes or patterns like stripes or checkers. This is a much better way to disambiguate objects than different colors. Another point of concern is fonts. Some players struggle to read any but the largest fonts. So if you can support large fonts, you're likely going to help out a lot of players. Now, giving the player the freedom to select any font size can cause a lot of UI resizing, and it's certainly a big undertaking. But if you know your scope and you just try to support a few prefixed font sizes, that's a lot less code work, and it's still going to help a lot of players. Maybe not people who need like the 100-point font, but you'll still get a lot of players helped. And lastly, if you really want to shoot for the stars, you should consider integrating screen reader support for your game. There are programs like JAWS that can narrate embedded text information to the player, and there's a heck of a lot of work required to make sure you prioritize what description gets read out loud first, and especially when a lot is happening simultaneously on the screen. But while this is no mean feat, I think Thinky games often have simple enough game states compared to like the frenetic action of other games that maybe your Thinky game could be playable by blind players with some screen reader integration. Now, motor control accessibility is a category where Thinky-style games have a leg up. Many Thinky games are turn-based and allow for theoretically infinite time between commands. And there's rarely a game over for a player who's forced to walk away from the game without pressing pause. This patient gameplay is a lifesaver to players with limited dexterity. So it's worth making sure you don't have other little pain points hidden in your control scheme. If your game uses mouse controls, consider that click and drag selection may feel effortless for you, but it is surprisingly difficult to the point of game breaking for other players. If you can replace instances of click and drag with a 2-click input system, you'll be doing a lot of players a world of good. Likewise, rapidly double-clicking is also tricky for some players. So if your game simply must have double-clicking as part of your control scheme, you do you. But just know that an alternate method of input will be easier for many players. If your game uses keyboard controls, remapping your controls is a must. Folks who are left-handed, one-handed, or missing digits likely can't use your default control scheme. If you give them remapping options, they'll build a control scheme that works for them. Likewise, control press and shift press commands are really tricky for a lot of commands whenever you're trying to do those 2 keys at once options. If your game requires these paired inputs, consider adding an alternate method where the player can press Control Shift once as a toggle, followed by the other key they were hoping to press. And if you're supporting gamepads, just know that there are a lot of really, really great customizable accessibility controllers out there. You do not need to reinvent the wheel in this regard. Just support the peripheral and the player will customize a control scheme that works for them with their controller. Now, cognitive accessibility issues can include dyslexia, poor focus, spotty memory, struggling to learn in the face of stress. These are maybe some of the trickiest problems for Thinky games to solve, as Thinky gameplay often involves keeping the player on the edge of confusion and sort of using absence of information to drive gameplay. But the trick is making sure the player is confused by the puzzles and not the content around the puzzles. Dyslexic-friendly fonts are a relatively easy win on this matter. It should be noted that dyslexic players won't always agree on which dyslexic-friendly fonts work best for them, which is all the more reason to make this an optional toggle. But there are many very inexpensive fonts to license that could make the difference between a player understanding your tutorial and then giving up in the first minute of gameplay. And if you can support it, having tooltips that remind the player of anything and everything they hover their mouse over, that's a great way to assist players who are struggling to remember what every object in your game does. Just because you taught them once in a tutorial how a game object operates does not mean they're going to remember it an hour later, let alone when they return to your game after a month-long break. So it's arguably impossible to have too many reminders or too much reinforcement, especially if these reminders occur in context-sensitive tooltips. But the tricky issue is, since Thinky games often thrive off of having some question marks and user experimentation, the goal is usually to introduce new concepts rapidly enough to stay interesting without overwhelming the player, which leads us to another avenue of accessibility design: stress and pacing. Even if your game can answer the interface challenges your players might have, your game can still be full of stressful pain points that cause players to give up on your game. A problem with any game ever made that will ever be played is that there's some minimal amount of stress and frustration required for the player to apply meaning to their success and feel fun. But once that stress and frustration exceeds the threshold, the player stops having fun and can give up on the game. And nowadays, there's a nearly infinite supply of other games to play. So there's always a chance that they'll give up on your game and never come back. But the good news is, just as Thinky games by their nature are more accessible to players with motor control concerns due to the patient gameplay, the same lack of urgency can make the often brain-bustingly stressful puzzles of a Thinky game actually a lot easier to process. You don't have a timer ticking down and there's no other players trying to shoot them in the head while they're thinking of this puzzle. It's a lot easier to self-manage the stress of a puzzle game than it is in, say, an action title or a multiplayer shooter. With Thinky games, where much of the challenge is learning an application, pacing can be a tricky thing to pull off. There's maybe an order of concepts that you consider to be the logical progression of difficulty, but there's no way to really be sure which concepts the players will master in what order. So you should make great tutorials, and that's really simple advice, but more importantly, you should make these tutorials gradual and granular, building one concept at a time. And while this is probably going to sound defeatist, you should also assume that more than half the players forget more than half of what you taught them more than half the time. And so the answer is not to repeat tutorials, but to have second chance tutorials littered throughout your game. To reiterate my prior point about tooltips for cognitive accessibility, if you only put your information in the tutorial, your players may never really learn the concepts. But if you give them on-demand reminders and prompters, you give them an infinite number of chances to practice and learn. Best practices for tutorial designs could be a presentation in and of itself, and you should really check out Gwen's talk from yesterday if you haven't already seen it about great ways to reinforce learning. But a useful analog to imagine when you're making a tutorial is you're building a mental model of your game in the player's mind in much the same way that you would build a ship in a bottle. And you can only build a ship in a bottle by passing each little piece of the ship through the bottleneck one at a time and assembling it on the other side. You can't build a ship in a bottle by trying to shove multiple pieces through the bottleneck all at once. You can't expedite the process. You got to spread out the learning. Or to put it another way, you sort of have to imagine every player as the guy from Memento with anterior retrograde amnesia that could cause them to forget parts of your game at any moment. You can and should build a great tutorial, but you then need to design around the fact that your tutorials may not stick. An in-game manual that the player can access at any time is a great way to deal with the problem of players not learning concepts in the order that you were hoping. Yes, it can be a lot of work to create a clear and concise and presentable index of game topics, but for players who haven't played your game in a while, this is the difference between an easy refresher and having to restart from the beginning to regain one's footing. And this is also one of the times where accessibility features and dev tools overlap. Having an in-game manual doesn't just help your players, it helps your QA team, as this becomes a definitive source of truth for checking to see if something is a bug. If your in-game behavior doesn't match what your in-game manual says, there's either a bug in your behavior or a bug in your help index. And if your game is able to provide on-demand in-game hints, that's an excellent way to serve players who get stumped in your game. You may be reluctant to give players a shortcut to solving your game, but consider that a player who is asking for help is a player who wants to see more of your game, but is struggling on one step of the saga. You may be spoiling a single element of your game, but you're preserving their ability to experience everything else in your game. One thing a lot of Thinky games do that's great for pacing and cognitive accessibility is the option to replay levels or reset and resolve puzzles. Replaying a known quantity is a great way for a player to experiment and reinforce their understanding of the rules. This is a feature that a lot of Thinky games offer, and I'd argue that if you're making a puzzle game that does not have an easy element for replaying old levels, rethink your plans or your gameplay loop until you can make it happen, especially if you have a scoring system or some way to solve puzzles with a varying degree of success. Now, perhaps the most important factor in your game's pacing is your game's fault tolerance. How does your game treat mistakes and errors? How many times can a player attempt a thing? And what is the real-life time cost when a player fails? On the one end of the spectrum, you have like massively multiplayer online games where they often penalize your failure by making you spend minutes walking back to your corpse. Fortunately, most Thinky games live on the other side of this equation, and they often give you almost no penalty for failure, aside from maybe a grumpy noise or visual effect and a request to try again. So if your game is forcing the player to redo parts of the game when they fail, that's maybe a good way to up the stakes, but it's also a great way to stress out players and make them quit. Thinky games have a distinct advantage when it comes to managing fail states, as many Thinky games include some combination of grid-based logic, discrete game states, and limited reliance on randomness. And this combination of constraints makes it easier to give your player an undo button compared to, say, team working on a first-person shooter in a contiguous 3D space. This affordance allows a player the luxury to immediately correct an error as soon as they spot it, minus any restart or retread. And if your game state contains a reasonably small number of available moves at any given junction, you could go a step further and preview the outcomes of the moves before the player selects an action, letting the player feel smart by not making mistakes in the first place. Now, I'd argue that technically every game has an undo button. It's just sometimes called restart or reload. A lot of really good Thinky games have undo buttons, and I've yet to hear anyone say, you know, I would play more puzzle games if only I had to go through more Hollow Knight-style retraversal every time I failed. Now, you may decide you want to put limits and constraints on how often players can undo their actions, but I'd argue that having some ability to undo is a common enough feature in the genre that players will notice it if you don't have it. And an undo button isn't just an affordance for your players, it's also a quality of life feature for your testing team. Your undo feature may not be free and effortless to implement, but you will likely earn back the time you spend on the feature by saving your QA's time and sanity as they try to reproduce bugs. So even if you want to give the player of the shipped game limited undo options, I'd recommend a limitless undo feature as a gift to your QA people. Of course, the particulars of the game will determine which type of undo, if any, your game offers. If you haven't seen it yet, check out John Lee Cooper's talk from yesterday for some great thoughts on this topic. And if you do have an option to undo that causes a rollback to the prior game state, chances are that means you have some groundwork in place for the game to look ahead and preview outcomes in your UI and let the player browse outcomes instead of engaging in brute force, failing and undoing loops. So I've talked about accessibility features as they could apply to any game. Now I'd like to talk about some specific examples in my own work. As mentioned earlier, I set out to make an accessible game, and the quest to provide challenging gameplay paired with accessibility led to a lot of Thinky-style design decisions. Hopefully by seeing how we leverage Thinky qualities for accessibility, you can do the same and leverage accessibility for your Thinky games. Now, the goal with Quarterstaff was to see if we could distill the martial arts fantasy of a game like Arkham Asylum or Ninja Gaiden into a patient style of gameplay for people who couldn't normally hold a controller and enjoy a game like Devil May Cry. And while strategy and tactic games often embrace randomness and dice, I knew that for this game, it was important that the strategy never involved success or failure because of random chance. In short, we were asking ourselves, can we make a really challenging game that you won't hate playing moment to moment? And so these constraints led us to Thinky-style game properties. We ended up with a turn-based game state, action that took place on a grid, and a departure from randomness. Now, excising randomness was more than just an aesthetic choice. It was a pragmatic choice to create a world that could be undone. If there was random chance in the game, we'd have a situation where the player can't just undo any action that doesn't grant them they could just undo any action that doesn't grant them the random outcome they wished for. Or we'd be stuck trying to smooth over the weirdness of having to disable undo after every die roll. And while there was an initial thought that perhaps we should limit the number of undos, we abandoned that early on in favor of a system where the player can undo as much as they'd like, with the caveat that they can only go back one turn, and they cannot undo a failed mistake. The hero has to survive a move so they can cast the step back in time spell to actually undo the game. Now, limiting undo to one turn saved us a ton of work trying to save out a theoretically infinite list of prior moves and board states. And similarly, our decision to not let the player undo mission-ending mistakes was primarily a time-saving decision, but it also helped us up the stakes and give the player the freedom to experiment while still putting them on high alert when their hit points ran low. And we took this notion of undoing actions beyond the moment-to-moment gameplay and applied it to the player's RPG progressions. This was a desire to capture the RPG joy of increasing in power without also capturing the RPG pain of making level-up choices before you fully know the rules and invariably want to reset your character after you finally learn what best suits your playstyle and it's 4 or 40 hours into the game. And this became more than a quality of life feature. It became part of the gameplay itself. Certain levels of the game were made to feel impossible at first, but with a quick reassignment of your stats, they're actually quite doable. So a player could learn the ropes of Quarterstaff by making a move, then pressing undo, making a move and pressing undo. This was possible, but not something we wanted to necessarily encourage. The deterministic nature of the game meant we could very easily preview the results of any given action. And that meant we could preview certain outcomes before the player committed to a move and spare them the trial and error. And moreover, we knew that we had a lot of information going on in our game state at any one time. So it just felt like good cognitive accessibility to do the math for the player and not make them have to calculate each move and see if it's dangerous or not. So in this scheme, the player may have X number of tiles that they can move to, which we show with a brightened alpha channel, and any move that would result in an injury is shown with a red fill. And it's worth noting that for colorblindness accessibility, we only ever use one color to show danger zones. I'm colorblind, and I couldn't tell you the exact shade. I mean, the team tells me it's red. But the point is I don't need to know the color. I just need to know that there is a color fill on dangerous tiles. Now, had we used more than one color to show just more states, we'd need to resort to stripes, checkers, or some sort of pattern to help players like me tell these tile shading effects apart. But if there's just one color, we kind of sidestep that problem. And when making the system, I had serious fears that we had just flipped a switch to set the game to too easy. So I was pleased when playtesters still made plenty of mistakes and rarely found levels to be no-brainer puzzles. Players would get reckless and impatient and avoid the warnings, and it still took players some experience and mastery for them to really grasp that, sometimes something that appears like a bad move is actually the right move to set up a future turn. We didn't just want to assume that we knew what we were doing. Generic Lake Monster paired up with Able Gamers Foundation to have 10 accessibility testers play an early build of the game, and 9 out of the 10 testers completed the early build. Only the totally blind player was unable to meaningfully navigate the game. And it was from these testers that we learned some harsh lessons about how fatiguing clicking and dragging can be, and how thankful the testers were for a game that auto-pauses. And I'm proud to say the final iteration of the game captures the accessibility we hope to achieve, while still preserving the challenging puzzle gameplay. Our dedicated QA spent in excess of 100 hours to 100% all the bonus objectives in the game. We've gotten feedback that the game's pretty damn hard, but no one has really complained that it's too easy yet, or if they feel that way, they haven't told us. So if anyone tells you that accessibility design is just a fancy word for adding easy modes, tell them to get bent. So if my quest for accessibility led me to Thinky design principles, I believe Thinky design principles have a huge potential for accessible games. Obviously, I can't describe all Thinky games with a single brush, but if you have discrete game states, grid logic, limited reliance on randomness, and no urgency for player inputs, you're in a great position to cater to players with motor control disabilities. And with a little planning, you can serve players with audio, visual, and cognitive challenges. You're almost halfway up the accessibility struggle mountain. And I'd be fooling to say if this stuff was easy, and I don't want to set up the impossible expectation that a game can be accessible to all players. There's just no way for you to predict and accommodate every player out there, and you'd never finish your game if you tried. So pick a few areas of accessibility that you want to target, kill as many of the pain points as you can, and don't try to solve everything unless you're a billionaire. In that case, maybe go for it. But stick to a few things and tackle those. For example, with quarterstaff, we knew motor control issues would be our A priority target. And I knew my own color blindness would help us make a game that could serve colorblind players. But we absolutely knew that serving totally blind players remained a stretch goal. And we tried our best to support it, but ultimately knew we lacked the experience to realize it and deprioritized it as a feature. Your game can't cater to everyone, but with a little planning, you can make a game for players who are normally iced out of a lot of great gaming experiences. And while accessibility features take time and effort, it's a heck of a lot easier to do this stuff if it's worked early into your plans instead of trying to tack it on later. And often the real trick to accessibility design is just being able to empathize with gamers that are not like you. Of course, what is game design other than a fancy word for empathy? And with that, I'm done. Thank you so much for listening. Here are some links to find out more about some of the amazing accessibility resources that we found indispensable to our journey. And if my talk has got you interested in accessibility, please check these out. If you're curious to learn more about quarterstaff, check out the demo on Steam. And hopefully I've left enough time for a question or two. So yeah, have at it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Matt. That was excellent. I love that you've identified the connection between Thinky Games and the accessible potential of Thinky Games. We have a feature in our Thinky Games database where we mark games as whether they involve action or not. And we've had emails from people saying, thank you for putting that in because I have motor impairments or something like that. And they're just, but we didn't put it in there for that reason. We just thought this is a great thing to highlight about this game. And it's ended up being really useful for these folks.
Yeah, because really the players, the single biggest pain point is where they drop out. And sometimes just any amount of demanding twitch reflexes can get them to stop playing a game. So yeah.
Absolutely. So I think I only have time for one question.
Okay.
And then we'll move over to the next talk. And so I'm going to be selective. We've got a lot of questions through.
Okay.
So I'm sorry, folks, you're going to have to take them to the Discord afterwards. But I'm going to pick one of them in particular, and maybe it's answered by your final slide here, which is from No Face in the chat. Do you have a set list or database to guide yourselves on which possible situations or disabilities that would require certain accessibility settings? This talk itself is a great resource for that, but do you have any suggestions about where people can go?
The first link I have listed here, the Game Accessibility Guidelines, has an amazing checklist, and it breaks things down by like cognitive, visual, audio, speech, all that stuff. It even kind of breaks things down to like easiest things to solve, intermediate problems to solve, advanced problems to solve. And it bases everything of like, can the player do this? Can the player do this? And so it's a great sort of like just like a QA checklist to say like, hey, can the player do these things in our game? If so, cool, we're probably in the right direction for accessibility. So yeah, that Games Accessibility Guideline, that's the place to go.
Great, thank you. We'll have to leave it there. There were loads of great questions, but I hope people will take them into the Discord thread. If people aren't in the Discord and you want to ask questions, it's at thinkygames.com/Discord. And yeah, so now we'll switch over to the next talk. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.